Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Mead Made, and alright, so I was recently working on an airbrushing project, and my airbrush started sputtering, and then it just completely stopped altogether. Has this ever happened to you? Have you experienced something like this? Because today, in this video, we're going to be talking about a common issue that happens to everyone, no matter their skill level. We'll explore this issue, why it happens, and how to stop it, ensuring your airbrush performs smoothly every single time. Alright, so the issue I was having is something that is called tip dry. So what is tip dry? In simple terms, tip dry is when the paint builds up and dries on the tip of the needle of your airbrush. So it's the tip of the needle, and it's where paint dries. So you can kind of see tip dry. But when this happens, it's honestly like a speed bump in your painting process because it's a big interruption. When this happens while you're in the middle of painting, it can lead to inconsistent spray patterns, spattering, and worst of all, it can just give clogs. Now here's the thing, every airbrush artist from beginners to seasoned pros face this issue. It's not a matter of if it happens, but when it happens. If you're just starting out, tip dry can especially be frustrating because it often mimics other problems. You might be thinking, is it a clogged nozzle? Did I not thin my paint correctly? But in reality, it's just tip dry and it's putting the brakes on your project. Diagnosing tip dry is like trying to figure out why you're getting blurry photos when taking a picture. You know, is it a camera shake or is your focus not on? Like, both can ruin a photo, but once you determine what it is, it can be a lot easier to take that clear picture. And that's the thing when it comes to tip dry. Once you know what to look for, managing tip dry becomes much easier. While we can't completely avoid tip dry, understanding its causes is key to preventing it from ruining your work. So let's dive into what causes tip dry. There are a lot of variables to tip dry that really I think you should know because first off, let's talk about the paint. The paint, especially when dealing with water-based paints, tip dry can happen quickly because the air is blowing across that needle, causing the paint to dry even faster and starting to dry right on that needle tip. And acrylics can be especially tricky because of how fast they can dry. This can lead to tip dry before you know it. Now, another thing is environmental factors. If you're in a dry place, it's going to make things even worse for you. Low humidity is a real pain. It's like the paint solvent just disappears into thin air, leaving you with a crusty needle tip. And on the other side of that, if you have high humidity, you're honestly less likely to get tip dry due to the moisture in the air. It's not allowing that paint to dry on the needle tip. And another thing is your air pressure. If you crank it up way too high, you're just asking for trouble. High air pressure can speed up drying processes of your needle tip, making it way more likely to be able to get dry tip. Now, let's not even forget our paint consistency. And honestly, thick paint, that's another headache that you can deal with because if you don't thin your paint properly, you're going to gunk up your needle faster than you can say clogged nozzle. Oh, and here's something else. People often overlook the length of their airbrushing sessions. Those marathon sessions might seem super productive, but it's just a recipe for dry tip. Because the longer you go without cleaning your needle, it's more and more gunk allowing to be built up on that needle of yours. So there you have it. Basically, it's paint type, humidity, air pressure, paint consistency, session length. These are all things that can contribute to tip dry. So now that we've talked about what causes it, let's talk about how we can prevent it from happening to keep our airbrush running smoothly as possible. The first thing is air pressure. You know how cranking up the air pressure, it sometimes feels like you're getting the job done faster, like, yeah, I'm getting that paint down. But actually, this could be working against you and giving you tip dry. So the solution? You guessed it. Dial it back a bit, maybe between 15 and 30 psi. You'll still have enough oomph to, really spray and get that paint out, but without speeding up the drying times. Now, this is also super important when we're dealing with fine detail work. Now let's talk about paint consistency. Have you ever tried to paint with pudding? That's kind of what thick paint does for your airbrush. It gunks up that needle faster, and it's just, you're asking for a clogged nozzle. So thin it out. If not for your airbrush, at least do it for me. Another thing for this is using the right thinner. Whatever your paint manufacturer recommends, or if you're working with acrylics, I recommend good old-fashioned distilled water. It's clean and it won't mess with your paints. Now, what about our environment? A dry workspace is like an extra helper to tip dry. Same goes for those long sessions too, because the longer you're using your airbrush, the more prone you're going to become to getting tip dry. That's where retarders and flow improvers can really come into play. These magic little potions can slow down your drying time. With just a few drops, it can be a real game changer. But I'll say this, start small, because we're not making soup here, folks. Just a few drops in your color cup can go a long way. And another good thing for your workspace, if it's really dry, is just adding, honestly, a humidifier in the room that you're actually airbrushing, because just that little bit of moisture can really help a lot. But even with all of these tips, sometimes paint insists on drying on the tip of that needle, and that's where regularly cleaning your airbrush is absolutely crucial. And honestly, just a quick wipe of the needle every so often can help prevent buildup that can lead to clogs and sputtering and all this other stuff. But it'll help your airbrush keep running smoothly. And you won't have to stop in the middle of a project. I personally like to do this when I'm changing between colors because it just takes a second to pull out your needle, get some distilled water on a paper towel, and just do a nice wipe off of it. So really, when it comes to like fighting against tip dry, all you have to do is keep an eye on your air pressure, make sure you're thinning your paints properly by using retarders or flow improvers or distilled water. You want to clean your airbrush regularly and make sure you're just not in a really dry space. But if you do these things, you're going to be able to fight tip dry and it will not stand a chance. Alright, so we know what causes tip dry. We know how to help prevent tip dry. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. What happens if I actually get it? What do I do? And honestly, even if you're doing everything right, this annoying problem will still pop up every now and then. But don't sweat it. I've got you. So, I've got 3 easy ways to be able to clean off your airbrush and keep it happy and honestly to keep you happy too. So the first one is my trusty Q-tip method. This is my go-to method every single time I get tip dry. So all I do is take a Q-tip and dip it in some airbrush cleaner or some distilled water and carefully wipe around the needle tip. And easy does it here. We're not trying to bend anything. The cotton is soft enough to get into those tight little spots without causing any damage. Now the next technique is getting a soft toothbrush. This is a go-to when you're dealing with a little bit more stubborn paint and it keeps clinging on to that airbrush needle. And all you do is you're going to dip your brush into the cleaner and then just gently scrub all around the needle and the area. Now, the key here is gentle. We are not brushing our teeth here. This is a delicate instrument we're trying to clean. When I use this method, I always take the air cap off as well, because it just makes it a lot easier to access the needle tip and the surrounding area. And last but not least, the paintbrush method. You guessed it, we're going to use a paintbrush. So all you gotta do is grab a small, soft paintbrush, and I always prefer to use a round brush. And then you're just going to dip this in your cleaner and then just sweep it across the needle. It's honestly like we're painting away our problems. This is great for those hard to reach spots because the other methods might miss them, but this one's really good at getting into those little cracks and crevices. Oh, and here's a little pro tip for you. So after you're done cleaning your airbrush, you want to give it a few quick blasts of air. It's kind of like a final rinse and it clears out any leftover residue and water or cleaner on your airbrush tip. So those are my main methods of cleaning tip dry. Now, I will say some folks like to use their fingernail and just kind of scrape off the dried paint, but honestly, that is something I don't like to do. Because one little slip and you could bend that needle and possibly you could stab yourself. And I'm not a fan of this method because, well, first I don't like being stabbed and I feel like you're a lot more prone to be able to damage the needle tip. But that's just my opinion. Now remember, whether you're using a Q-tip, a toothbrush, or a paintbrush, you always want to use distilled water or airbrush cleaner. I typically will use distilled water first, and then if the paint is being a little more stubborn and not coming off easily, that's when I'll switch to using my airbrush cleaner. So there's another special tool I keep in my tool belt to help prevent tip dry, and that is needle juice or needle lube, because I have Iwata lube and I have Badger needle juice. And these two work pretty much the exact same, so it doesn't really matter which brand you go with. So what is it? It's basically a special lube that is made for airbrush needles, and it creates a really slick barrier to where paint cannot stick to the needle. And when paint can't stick to the needle, it can't dry on the needle, and which means it's not going to clog your airbrush. Now, using it is super easy. You just put a tiny drop on your needle tip and then just spread it around. You don't need to drown the thing. It's just a thin coat does the trick. I also dip my needle directly into the bottle, and then I'll take a paper towel and just roll it around to remove any excess. Whichever way you want to do it, just make sure you remove any extra on there because you just need a thin coat of it on your needle. So once you've got it on there, you put it back into your airbrush, and then you're going to notice it is running smoother than a hot knife through butter. Now here's the thing, needle juice or lube is not some type of magic potion that is going to just solve all of your problems. It works best when you're also doing all of the other stuff that we've talked about earlier, like thinning your paints, keeping your workspace at a good humidity level, and also making sure you've got the right PSI. Think of it as a part of your toolkit, not a replacement for good habits. So here's the fun thing, even if you're doing everything right, there's always one sneaky little culprit that could be causing your tip dry. And what could that be? We're talking technique, folks. Now, you can have all of the fancy gear and the perfect mixtures of paint, but if your technique is off, you're still going to get tip dry. What's that secret sauce? It's all about the air down, paint back method. It sounds simple, but you'd be surprised by how many people get this wrong because they're just not used to the proper technique yet. So if you just yank back on your trigger and get paint flowing before you got air flowing, or if you cut the paint before you let air have a hot second to be able to kind of keep spraying out, you're just asking for trouble. That's going to build up paint on the needle a lot faster, and before you know it, you've got yourself a clog. So here's how to do it right. First, you're going to press down on the air. Then, only then, you're going to pull back and start getting paint flowing. Then when you're done, ease off the paint by pushing the trigger forward, but keep that air flowing for another beat or two. Because you want that air flowing. It's like you're giving your airbrush an extra quick rinse after each spray. I know this sounds like a small thing, but trust me, it's huge. Because if you take any tip out of this video, please make it this. Get the technique down, and it will make a world of difference for you. And speaking of airbrush tips, you know how some people are always like, you should always do this with your airbrush, or you should never do this with your airbrush. We're talking about the pieces of advice that make you wonder, is this really necessary? How easy is it to destroy my airbrush? So jump over to this video where I break down those internet claims and you can see what you should never do with your airbrush and see for yourself.